He was a man who stood before an empire and promised to die for his king. Yet, just hours later, trapped in a cold courtyard, he cursed and swore he never knew him. How does a fierce, unshakable protector turn into a broken coward in a single night? History remembers this man as a pillar of the early church, a theologian, a martyr, a leader of men. But before the catacombs of Rome, before the fiery crowds of Pentecost, and before the heavy, impending shadow of the cross, he was simply Simon, a man of the sea, a man whose hands were calloused from coarse ropes, and whose face was etched with the exhaustion of long, unforgiving nights. Simon's life was defined strictly by the tangible. In his world, if you couldn't touch it, if you couldn't cast a net over it, or pull it by brute force from the deep, it simply didn't exist. He lived under the crushing weight of Roman taxation, trapped in the predictable, exhausting rhythms of survival. Until the day a young rabbi from Nazareth walked along his shore. Jesus did not offer Simon political liberation, wealth, or earthly power. He offered him an impossible mystery. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Think about the sheer irrationality of that moment. What made Simon drop his nets, his entire livelihood, his identity, his security, in a single instant? It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't a calculated political move. It was the spark of an immediate, consuming affection. From that very first gaze, Simon's heart recognized something his mind could not yet fully articulate. He was drawn to Jesus by a force stronger than the tides of Galilee. He didn't just want to learn from this rabbi. He needed to be near him. Peter's love was never quiet. It was never polite, cautious, or calculated. It was a loud, impulsive, and sometimes reckless fire. We see the true depth of this desperate affection on a terrifying, wind-swept night on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are trapped in a fierce storm, completely paralyzed by the fear of drowning. Suddenly, through the blinding rain, a figure appears, walking on the water. They cry out in terror, thinking it is a ghost. But Jesus speaks through the wind. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Look closely at Peter's response. The other 11 disciples stay frozen in the boat, gripping the wet wood for dear life. But Peter, his love makes him reckless. He doesn't look at the waves. He looks only at the Master. He shouts, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." Consider the absolute absurdity of that request. Peter didn't ask Jesus to calm the storm so he would be safe. He asked Jesus to pull him into the storm, just so he could walk where Jesus was walking. For Peter, safety was not a place. Safety was a person. To be sinking in the waves next to Jesus was vastly preferable to being safe in a boat without him. He steps over the edge, and even when his faith falters and the dark water begins to swallow him, his immediate cry is of desperate reach for intimacy. "Lord, save me." This was the core of Peter's love, an unyielding, frantic desire to close the distance between himself and Christ. As the months turned into years, Peter's love deepened from an impulsive attraction into a fierce, intensely protective devotion. When Jesus asked his disciples the ultimate question, "Who do you say that I am?" it was Peter who burst forth with the historic declaration, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But Peter's love, while fierce, was also deeply flawed by pride. At the Last Supper, when Jesus tenderly knelt to wash the dust from the disciples' feet, Peter recoiled in shock. He could not bear to see the one he worshipped acting as a slave. And when Jesus predicted that the hours ahead would be so dark that everyone would scatter and abandon him, Peter's loud devotion flared up again. He stood up, looked his Savior in the eye, and declared with absolute sincerity, "Even if everyone else falls away, I will not. I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death." He meant every single word. Peter truly, deeply believed his love was bulletproof. We see the terrifying proof of his loyalty. Just hours later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, a mob of soldiers and temple guards, armed to the teeth with swords and clubs, arrives to arrest Jesus. The atmosphere is thick with panic. The other disciples are confused, terrified, and ready to scatter into the darkness. But Peter draws a small, meager fishing sword. Think about the visual scene. A lone fisherman, stepping completely alone between an entire armed Roman garrison and his master. He swings wildly in the dark, striking the servant of the high priest and cutting off his ear. It was an act of beautiful, foolish suicide. Peter was fully willing to die right then and there, fighting a hopeless battle, purely to shield the man he loved. But Jesus stops him. In a move that completely shatters Peter's worldview, Jesus heals the soldier's ear and commands Peter to put away his sword. Jesus chooses the path of absolute surrender. And in that exact moment, Peter's reality fractures. He was entirely prepared to die for a conquering king, but he did not know how to watch his king willingly submit to execution. Disarmed, confused, and heartbroken, Peter watches them lead his master away. This brings us to the darkest night of Peter's life, the agonizing hours where his human weakness clashed violently with his soul's devotion. Following from a safe, agonizing distance, Peter slips into the courtyard of the high priest. He sits by the fire, shivering from the cold, desperately trying to blend into the crowd of servants and soldiers. But the light of the fire betrays him. 3 times, people look closely at his face. 3 times, they point their fingers at him and say, "You were with that Nazarene." And 3 times, paralyzed by a sudden, choking wave of self-preservation and fear, Peter denies it. With each denial, his words grow more aggressive until he finally curses, "I do not know the man." And then the rooster crows. The Gospel of Luke records a devastating detail that tears at the heart of anyone who has ever failed someone they love. It states that at that exact microsecond, as the rooster's cry pierced the cold morning air, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Imagine that gaze cutting through the crowded courtyard. It was not a look of anger. It was not a look of spite or vindication. It was a look of profound, agonizing sorrow. It was the eyes of Jesus, reminding Peter of who he truly was and what he had just done. The weight of that single look completely crushed Simon Peter. The realization that he had broken the heart of the one he cherished more than life itself was utterly unendurable. He did not stay to explain himself. He did not stay to fight. He fled into the blackness of the early morning, collapsing into the dirt, weeping bitterly. An indifferent man would have moved on, relieved to have simply saved his own skin from the Romans. But Peter's weeping was the agonizing proof of his love. His tears were the liquid grief of a man whose devotion was vast, but whose flesh was tragically weak. But the story of Peter's love does not end in the dirt of that dark courtyard. True love is never defined by our worst moments, but by grace's power to rebuild them. After the resurrection, we find Peter right back where his journey began, on the Sea of Galilee, fishing. He is trapped in a limbo of immense guilt, wondering if his betrayal has disqualified him forever. Suddenly, a familiar voice calls out from the shoreline, telling them to cast their nets on the right side of the boat. The nets instantly fill to breaking capacity. John looks across the water, his eyes wide, and whispers, "It is the Lord." Look at Peter's love flare up once again. He doesn't wait for the boat to row to shore. He doesn't care about the massive, miraculous catch of fish. He throws on his cloak, plunges into the freezing water, and swims desperately through the waves, just to get to Jesus first. His love is entirely uninhibited now. He is running directly back to the one he failed, because even in his immense shame, he knows that only Jesus can heal the wound of his betrayal. When the other disciples finally arrive, they find Jesus sitting by a charcoal fire. This detail is vital. The last time Peter stood near a charcoal fire, he was denying Jesus. Christ intentionally recreates the exact setting, the smell of the smoke, the warmth of the coals, not to punish Peter, but to thoroughly cure his guilt. Jesus looks at him and asks a question that echoes through eternity. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Notice that Jesus doesn't ask, "Why did you fail me?" He doesn't ask, "Can I trust you not to run away next time?" He asks only about his heart. Peter, stripped of his old arrogance and pride, responds softly, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." 3 times, Jesus asks the exact same question. 3 times, Peter affirms his love, wiping away the stain of his 3 denials by the fire. But look at the profound change in Peter. He no longer brags about being stronger than the other disciples. He appeals entirely to Jesus' omniscience. On the 3rd time, Peter says, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." It is as if he is saying, "Lord, if you look at my actions, it looks like I hate you. If you look at my cowardice, it looks like I am a traitor. But look deeper, Lord. Search my soul. You know everything. You know that beneath my brokenness, beneath my fear, beneath my catastrophic failure, I love you." And Jesus accepts that broken, honest love. With each affirmation, he gives Peter a sacred mandate. Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Jesus was telling him, take the passionate love you have for me and pour it out onto my people. From that morning on the beach, Simon Peter was a transformed man. His love was no longer a wild, uncontrolled emotional fire. It had matured into an unshakable, lifelong covenant. The man who once trembled before a servant girl now stood open-faced before the high priests of Israel, declaring, "We must obey God rather than men." For over 30 years, Peter fed the sheep of Christ, building the very foundations of the early church. And finally, the day came when Peter's love was asked to make the ultimate payment. In the city of Rome, under the cruel persecution of Emperor Nero, Peter was sentenced to death by crucifixion. As he looked at the cross prepared for him, historical tradition tells us that Peter made one final, staggering request. He asked to be crucified upside down, declaring himself utterly unworthy to die in the same position as his Lord. In his final moments, hanging under the Roman sky, Peter's love came full circle. His life ended, not in a cry of denial, but in a final, breathtaking act of absolute humility and complete surrender. Peter's journey teaches us that the love Jesus desires is not a perfect, flawless love. He desires a love that is honest, a love that runs back to him even after it falls. Peter's story proves that no matter how far you fall, grace is always running back to you. If this journey touched your heart today, let us know in the comments below which part of Peter's life resonated most deeply with your own walk of faith. And if you want to discover more deep, cinematic journeys through the stories of the Bible, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Thank you for watching. And remember, even in our deepest brokenness, He looks at our hearts. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.